Yeah, so we're going to get into the people shift side of it. So we talked about the technology shift and how that kind of set things up for it to be easier. Now we're kind of going into the people shift of it. COVID is really what kind of advanced things, because prior to that, the technology was already shifting, right? The technology was already setting itself up to be able to do some of these things. That was already happening. But there were still people that are like, hey, this is already working the way that we're doing this. Do we really need to have people working remotely? Does that really make sense for us to do that? People are like, hey, look, we're doing it in these small pockets. Let's do these little pilots. Let's have this. Let's do a few classes this way. Let's have this person that's been working here for 15 years, they have to relocate because their spouse has a different job. Can't we keep them on? Okay, let's pilot it out. Let's try it. So it was happening in little spurts, but there was still a lot of resistance because people don't like to change things. People are like, hey, this is already working. So then the pandemic happens, and they're like, okay, everybody's going on lockdown. Everybody go home. We got to keep things going though, and especially as like the pandemic expanded out, it was like we got to keep things going. So it went from like little pockets of people to everybody needs to do this. And so because of those circumstances, hands were forced, and theories were tested. We got to see like what works, what doesn't work, what was kind of like just somebody that didn't want to do it, and what was a situation where it's like, yeah, this isn't as good as it is when we're all in the office together.
I so remember as the lockdown started to happen, it just so happened I had done a training, and we used to have to do training teaching people how to use video conferencing and on the new, they had a new system. And it was probably 3 weeks after that, because during the training, people weren't paying much attention. They're like, yeah, this doesn't apply to me. I'm going to be in the office. This is. And so then 3 weeks after, I got many phone calls from people who had like halfway paid attention. And they're like, now, how do I hook all this up? Like, how do I, get my camera set? Do I need, all those things. I need to get my home office set up. And while the technology had been advancing, and so we kind of had the technologies, in place, or they were pretty easy, easy to get. I know external cameras were, there was a shortage of those, but, it existed. So it was just, could we get those? The thing that I would say was a challenge in that beginning was to throw everybody in and everybody's just kind of like sink or swim. And so while the technology was there, what we knew were capabilities for working together, other people kind of learning on the fly. And then once they did get a taste of it, they're like, oh, okay. So this could be another option and it could be viable. After things kind of started to smooth out, we did find that there were some spaces where people really did enjoy it. Now, I think the things we did with the schools, we're not going to do a whole postmortem on that, but there were, it was not well thought out. And, what we know could be done with planned distance education. That was a hot mess of just, throwing, the kids go home and the teachers get a webcam. But as far as like the workers, I think once they kind of got the hang of it, they're like, yeah, I can be here at a different location and I can get my work done.
Examples that came to my mind is I remember talking to some people that were resistant. They didn't want to, they weren't interested in anything that had to do with video communication. And then when the pandemic happened, they were forced to use it, and they finally got over the fear of like, how do I don't know how to do this. I don't do this, and saw how it worked. It was like, oh, this is great. And the people that came to my mind were like, they were counselors. And so they're like, oh, I'm able to do counseling over this a heck of a lot easier than it is for me to go to the office. And so a couple of them have actually gone fully remote now, where they got rid of their physical offices, and they just do their counseling sessions all over video. Before, these people were like, absolutely not, like not even the slightest bit interested in it. And because they were forced to use it, and they were like, oh, this is actually very good. Now that's what they do.
Yeah, well, and part of that too with the technology shift and the people shift, because some of those things, like I know the counseling and some of the telemedicine, You could only practice within your, there were all the credentialing and all the regulatory environment that was there. And I know some of that was relaxed during the pandemic. And then, people have been pushing back as they've tried to revert some of those. So some places they've gone back to the way it was before the pandemic. But, others are like, oh, well, are there different ways that we can do, especially stuff that has the, per state credentialing. I know that was lagging behind what the technology could do, what the people wanted to do, but what the regulatory agencies would permit.
Yeah, and the multi-state thing is probably still a challenge. I know these particular counselors, they're just offering, we're in Texas and they're just offering services in Texas, not having to have a physical office that people have to come to, them included, has made things a lot easier for their clients and for them.
And as you were sharing that, I started thinking about, in the beginnings, way back when we were doing distance learning, and the original idea was to connect our teachers that were in a larger school with some of our rural schools that were smaller and didn't have access to certified instructors. And what I hear now is there's a lot of use of video conferencing in just large urban areas where the traffic, it's just hard to get around. You have a lot of stuff around you, you've got a lot of access. But if you think of like a large area near Los Angeles, it's just such a large area. And one of the things they do, I'm familiar with some of the ladies that are in the Calligraphy Guild. They divided LA into 7 different regional ones. And we've seen that even in offices where it's a large office building, but people will connect into the live meeting from their desk. They'll just connect through Zoom to the meetings and they're in the same physical location. So you really start to think about, okay, this can be used in many ways. So it's not just covering large distances measured in miles, but it also can be in time too, where you're like, okay, I can go 3 miles, but it's going to take me an hour. So it's easier for me to do it through video.
Yeah, and you mentioned the cities there and the congestion in the cities, and that's a statistic we have for this people shift part where office attendance remains roughly 30% lower than it was before the pandemic. Attendance is especially low in metropolitan areas like London, New York, San Francisco, with large shares of knowledge economy workers and expensive housing. So it's like, yeah, they're like, okay, why go into the office if I'm able to do the same quality of work remotely?
Or if you get there and it's a large building and then you're going to connect in through Zoom or Teams from your desk within the building, you're like, okay, well, I could have been at my house and come in the same way with that.
Yeah, I just think it's a larger, I think a lot of people are considering more of those types of factors when they're looking at employment now of like, okay, what's the cost of living near the office? Do I have to be at the office? How often do I have to go to the office? It's like, if you're having to pay an extreme amount of money to live in a certain area, you start to be like, okay, even though on paper my salary is higher if I work at this place, when I subtract all the expenses that it costs me to live there, to go to work there, it doesn't make sense. And I think people are taking more of those types of things into consideration, especially if it's like, okay, how much time am I spending in traffic? How long does it take me to get to work? Gas, vehicle wear and tear. All of those things are people are kind of factoring all of that in when they're looking at employment now.
All of those are, employee facing concerns. But if you look at it from the employer aspect, to be able to get access to talent, you've got a larger talent pool that you could access, especially, if you look at maybe you have your company in a place that is not quite as expensive to be. There's the flip of like the employee housing costs, but let's say you go to a little smaller market and it lowers your cost, but could you access a talent pool that's much larger than you could find in that particular location? So there's lots of things that go into that people shift. And anything else you can think of before we wrap up this section?
No, I mean, I know we'll we touched on it here, but we'll have a whole conversation where we really dig into some of the advantages and challenges of remote work. So, but I think we're ready to move into some different things on organization management and best practices.